She had been running for what felt like hours. Her lungs burned with every breath, sharp and uneven, like the forest itself was pushing back against her escape. The tall grass clawed at her legs, tearing what remained of her dress, leaving thin red lines across her skin that she could barely feel anymore. Behind her, somewhere far enough to almost feel safe, but close enough to never forget, the faint echo of sirens cut through the silence. Not the kind she had grown used to hearing. These were different, modern, cold, unforgiving. She didn't slow down. She couldn't, because the truth was, she wasn't just running from them. She was running from what she had done. Her name is Eliza Carter, and by the time this night is over, the world will decide whether she is a survivor or a monster. But that decision was never really hers to make, because long before she ever stepped foot into that forest, her life had already been written for her, and she just didn't know it yet. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. And to understand how a woman ends up running through the wilderness with blood on her hands, you have to go back to the place where it all began. Eliza arrived in Blackridge on a quiet afternoon. The kind of afternoon where the air feels too still, like the world is holding its breath. She had driven for nearly 6 hours to get there, following directions printed on a single sheet of paper that had arrived in the mail with no return address and no explanation beyond a set of coordinates and a hand-drawn map of a county road that most GPS systems did not even recognize. She had questioned it, of course. Somewhere between the 3rd and 4th hour of driving through open country where the horizon seemed to reset itself every few miles without getting any closer to anything, she had wondered more than once whether she was making a serious mistake. But she kept driving, because the alternative was turning back to a life she had already decided she could not continue living, and the map in her hands, however strange, was pointing towards something new. The town looked exactly like something out of a forgotten century. Wooden homes lined the dirt paths. Horses moved slowly through the streets. Lanterns hung outside every door, even though the sun had not yet begun to set. There were no power lines visible from the road, no satellite dishes, no signs of the modern world bleeding through. It was peaceful, too peaceful. The kind of quiet that settles on the back of your neck long before your mind can explain why it feels like a warning. She had been invited. That was the story she was given. A place to disconnect, a place to rebuild, a space designed for people who had lost their way in the modern world and needed somewhere to remember who they were before the damage set in. No phones, no internet, no outside contact. At the time, it felt like freedom. Looking back, it was something else entirely. She met him that same day. Daniel Hayes, the man everyone in Blackridge trusted without question. He was standing near the entrance of the main building when she arrived, and he greeted her the way someone greets a person they have been expecting for a very long time. Not with surprise and not with formality, but with the kind of settled certainty that made it feel like her presence there was simply the natural conclusion of something set in motion long before either of them acknowledged it. He had a way of speaking that made people feel seen, a calm presence and a quiet authority that never needed to raise its voice. He welcomed her like she had always belonged there, and for a while, she believed it. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months. Life in Blackridge followed a rhythm that felt almost hypnotic. Wake with the sun, work with your hands, eat together, sleep under the quiet watch of lantern light. The routine was relentless in the most soothing possible way, and within a few months Eliza had almost entirely stopped thinking about the life she had left behind. She stopped measuring time the way she once had. There were no deadlines in Blackridge, no notifications, no version of herself that the outside world expected her to perform. There was just the land, the labor, and the people around her who all seemed to have arrived through the same invisible current that had carried her there. There were rules, of course. There were always rules. No one leaves. No one asks about the outside. No one questions Daniel. At first, those rules felt like structure, like the kind of firm boundaries a person sets when they are trying to heal. Later, they felt like something else entirely. The structure began to feel like walls. The peace began to feel like a lid pressed down over something that wanted very much to move. But by the time Eliza started noticing the cracks in the life she had been handed, she was already too deep inside. And Daniel knew it. Daniel did not control the town with fear. He controlled it with belonging. He made people feel like they had been chosen, like their arrival in Blackridge was not coincidence, but selection, some quiet recognition of their worth that the outside world had consistently failed to offer them. Every conversation felt intentional. Every gesture felt meaningful. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, people listened with a particular kind of attention that felt less like courtesy and more like devotion. Eliza found herself drawn to him in ways she could not fully explain. Not just emotionally, psychologically. He seemed to understand her before she understood herself, seemed to anticipate her doubts before she voiced them, and meet her fears with exactly the kind of reassurance that dismantled them most effectively. He knew what she had been running from long before she ever told him. And when she finally did, late one evening near the end of her 3rd month in Blackridge, he did not judge her. He did not question her. He simply told her that she was safe now, that Blackridge was different, that he would never betray her. And that was the moment everything changed. Because trust, once given, becomes the easiest thing to manipulate. Their relationship grew quickly, almost too quickly, but in a place where time felt suspended, it made a strange kind of sense. Or at least, it felt like it did. They were married before the first year ended. A quiet ceremony. No records. No witnesses from outside. Just the town. Just Daniel. Just her. And for a while, it felt real. Until the night she found the door. It wasn't meant to be found. That much was clear the moment she saw it. Hidden beneath the floor of Daniel's study, concealed under a layer of wood that blended perfectly with the rest of the room. If she hadn't dropped the lantern, if the flame hadn't shifted just enough to reveal the faint outline of a seam in the floor, she never would have known it was there. But she did. And once something like that reveals itself, you cannot ignore it. The door opened into darkness. A narrow staircase that led down into something far colder than the world above. Each step felt heavier than the last, not physically, but mentally. Because somewhere deep inside, she already knew that whatever was waiting below would change everything. The room at the bottom was not what she expected. It wasn't old. It wasn't forgotten. It was modern, deliberately and unmistakably modern. Entirely out of place beneath the floors of a town that had spent years convincing its residents the modern world did not exist. Screens lined the walls. Dozens of them. Each one showing a different part of Blackridge in real time. Every house, every street, every person watched, recorded, and cataloged through high-resolution cameras that had been positioned with a precision that could only have been the result of meticulous, long-term planning. And in the center of the room, a desk with files. Organized, detailed, precise. She found her name within minutes. Eliza Carter. Date of entry. Psychological profile. Behavioral patterns. Emotional triggers. Every conversation she had ever had in Blackridge documented in transcripts she had never consented to. Every reaction she had ever shown analyzed in language that was clinical, calculated, and deeply invasive. Nothing had been incidental. Nothing had been private. Every moment she had believed was hers alone had belonged to someone else all along. And then she saw the label printed at the top of the page. Not resident. Not citizen. Subject. That was the moment she realized she had never been free, not even for a single second of the time she had spent inside those walls. But the worst part wasn't the cameras. It wasn't the surveillance. It wasn't even the fact that her entire life in Blackridge had been monitored down to the smallest detail. It was what she found next. Because the file didn't just describe her past. It described her future. Daniel had planned everything. From the moment she entered Blackridge to the moment she would break, every relationship, every conversation, every emotional connection she had formed had been designed, engineered, and controlled with a patience and a coldness that felt impossible to reconcile with the man who had told her she was safe. Even their marriage, especially their marriage, was never real. It was data, a test, a variable in a larger experiment. He had selected her specifically, someone with a history of isolation, someone searching for belonging, someone who would trust deeply and, once pushed far enough in exactly the right direction, break completely. But he hadn't accounted for one thing. What happens when the subject becomes aware? And that awareness changed everything. Because Eliza didn't confront him. Not immediately. She returned upstairs quietly, closed the door, put everything back exactly as it was. And when Daniel came home that night, she smiled. She spoke the same way she always had, calm and trusting and completely, convincingly unaware. Because if there is one thing more dangerous than a controlled subject, it is a subject who knows they are being controlled and decides to play along. She watched. She listened. She learned. For the first time since she arrived, she stopped being part of the system and started studying it from the inside, treating every interaction the way Daniel had always treated her, as a source of information to be understood and ultimately used. And what she discovered next was worse than anything she had seen in that room. Blackridge wasn't just a hidden town. It was a stage. Every moment, every interaction, every emotional breakdown had been captured, edited, packaged, and sent somewhere far beyond those walls to an audience that had no idea they were watching real people, real grief, real betrayal, real lives being dismantled one carefully produced frame at a time. She found the uploads. Archived footage organized by season and episode. Viewer metrics. Comment sections with millions of responses from people who had been following the story of Blackridge for years without ever suspecting that the people on their screens were not actors playing roles, but actual human beings living inside a controlled environment designed specifically to produce content from their suffering. She watched clips of her own lowest moments, replayed and re-edited, narrated over by a voice that had never once met her, turned into something dramatic and engaging and profitable. Her pain had a subscriber count. Her trust had a view count. Her love for Daniel had been turned into content, consumed by people who would never know her, but who felt entirely qualified to judge her. There were reaction videos. There were forum threads that ran for hundreds of pages. There were people online who had built entire followings around their commentary on her story, debating her choices, dissecting her expressions, speculating about what she would do next, as though she were a character rather than a person, and her suffering were a plot point rather than a life. Some called her naive. Some called her weak. Some called her manipulative. Some said she deserved whatever was coming to her next. And then she found the most recent upload. It hadn't happened yet, but it was already planned. A breakdown. A public betrayal. A moment designed to push her beyond the edge of what she could hold together and capture the full collapse on film for an audience that had been waiting for it. Daniel wasn't just studying behavior. He was engineering it. And the entire world had been watching. But what they didn't know was that the story they were watching was about to change in a way no one had scripted. The next few days in Blackridge were different. Subtle, but unmistakably different. She began to shift her behavior in ways small enough to avoid detection, but deliberate enough to accomplish exactly what she needed. She tested boundaries. She watched reactions. She mapped patterns. She learned who reported to Daniel, who watched the watchers, and who had access to what and when. She began treating the people around her not as fellow residents, but as an ecosystem, a network of loyalties and dependencies that could be redirected if approached with enough patience and precision. She identified the two people in town whose trust in Daniel had already begun to thin, not through anything dramatic, but simply through the natural fatigue that comes from years of performing obedience. She worked those fraying edges carefully, never rushing, always planting rather than pulling. She introduced questions in conversations that sounded like idle observations. She cast small doubts in places where they would take root slowly and spread in ways that would look, to anyone watching, like nothing more than ordinary restlessness moving through a community. And slowly, carefully, she began to take back the one thing Daniel had never intended for her to have: control. Because if this was a performance, she was about to rewrite the script entirely. It didn't happen all at once. Something like this required precision, timing, patience. People began to notice small things, moments that didn't quite make sense, inconsistencies that grew harder to dismiss the more they accumulated. And once doubt enters a system built entirely on trust, it spreads. Slowly at first, then all at once. Daniel felt it. He was too practiced at reading people not to feel the shift. But by the time he understood what was actually happening beneath the surface of Eliza's calm, it was already too late. Because she had found the one thing he had never expected anyone to find: the broadcast system itself. The live connection that ran between Blackridge and the outside world. And she used it, not to escape, but to expose everything. Live. Unfiltered. No edits. No control. No narration from someone who had never met her and never would. Just the truth, delivered directly to the same audience that had been consuming a carefully managed version of it for years. For the first time, the people watching were not watching a story. They were watching reality. And reality is considerably harder to control than a narrative. The reactions were immediate. Confusion, outrage, disbelief. People who had spent years watching what they believed to be an elaborate reality program were suddenly confronted with the unedited truth of what they had actually been consuming. And the weight of that recognition was something no viewer metric had ever prepared Daniel for. He found her before the fire started. She was standing in the center of the town, calm, still, waiting. For the first time since she had known him, Daniel looked uncertain. Not afraid, but uncertain. And that was enough. He tried to speak, tried to explain, tried to regain control of a situation that no longer belonged to him in any meaningful way. But Eliza didn't respond. Because there was nothing left to say, and she had already said everything that needed to be said, not to him, but to the world. She turned and walked toward the edge of the square where the lantern she had left burning sat against the base of the supply barn. She picked it up without breaking stride. She did not look back at him when she let it go. The drywood caught faster than even she had expected. By the time Daniel understood what she had done, the barn wall was already a curtain of orange, and the fire was moving the way fire always moves when it finds something built to burn, hungrily and without hesitation. The alarm went up within seconds. People poured out of their homes. Some tried to form lines, passing buckets from the well the way they had been trained to. Others just stood and watched, because somewhere in the chaos they understood without being told that this was not an accident and that what they were witnessing was the last night Blackridge would ever exist. Daniel came after her. Of course he did. The man who had spent years controlling every variable around him was not about to let the one that had turned on him simply walk away. She heard him behind her, calling her name with the same calm authority that had once made her stop and listen without thinking. But she was through listening. She crossed the boundary of the town at a run, hit the tall grass at the edge of the tree line, and disappeared into the dark. The iPhone she had taken from the broadcast room, still logged into Daniel's own system, still streaming everything to an audience that was now watching in real time, was clenched in her hand. She didn't even realize the blood from a cut on her palm had already soaked across the screen. She had been running for what felt like hours. Her lungs burned with every breath, sharp and uneven, like the forest itself was pushing back against her escape. The tall grass clawed at her legs, tearing what remained of her dress, leaving thin red lines across her skin that she could barely feel anymore. Behind her, somewhere far enough to almost feel safe, but close enough to never forget, the faint echo of sirens cut through the silence. Not the kind she had grown used to hearing. These were different, modern, cold, unforgiving. She didn't slow down, even when her body begged her to, even when the sounds behind her grew louder, because she understood something now that she hadn't understood before. Escaping the town was never the end. It was just the beginning, because outside Blackridge, there was a world that had already decided who she was, a world that had watched her story unfold without ever knowing the full truth behind it. And now they were coming for her, not to save her, not to protect her, but to hold her accountable for a narrative they only partially understood. And that is the problem with stories. The version people believe is rarely the complete one. Eliza was captured just before sunrise. Exhausted, silent, unresisting, and as she was taken away, she didn't fight. She didn't explain. She didn't try to defend herself, because she knew something they didn't. The footage, the truth, the full story, it was already out there. And sooner or later, people would see it. But whether they believed it, that was something else entirely. Because in the end, the line between victim and villain is often decided by the audience. And the audience had already made up its mind. If you stayed until the end, thank you. More stories from Breach and Balance are already on your screen. Click one now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, don't miss what's coming next. See you there.